My husband Duncan told his entire family I was too dramatic for Christmas dinner, so he left me alone with the dishes while they went to his mother's house. I smiled, finished cleaning, and drove there myself with a beautifully wrapped gift. When his mother Laurel opened it in front of everyone, the room went dead silent. The envelope inside contained documents that would destroy everything Duncan thought he controlled. But this story didn't start on Christmas Day.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Not really. The unraveling began months before, with small comments that cut like paper, barely noticeable until you're bleeding. Sienna's always been sensitive, Duncan would say at dinner parties, his hand resting on my shoulder like a weight. She takes everything personally. The guests would nod sympathetically, and I'd force a laugh, pretending the words didn't hollow me out from the inside. It started so subtly I almost missed it. The way he'd roll his eyes when I spoke too long. How he'd check his phone when I told him about my day. The gentle corrections that weren't gentle at all. What Sienna means to say is, followed by a completely different sentiment than what I'd expressed. Duncan Spencer was a master of erosion. He never yelled, never threw things, never left bruises you could see. Instead, he carved away pieces of me with surgical precision, each cut so small I told myself it didn't matter. "You're overthinking again," became his favorite phrase. Anytime I questioned his behavior, his choices, his increasingly frequent late nights at the office. "This is why people find you exhausting, Sienna, you analyze everything to death." I started second-guessing every thought before I spoke. Was I being too sensitive? Too demanding? Too much? The questions became a constant chorus in my head, drowning out my own instincts until I couldn't tell the difference between intuition and paranoia. His family adored him. Duncan was the golden son, the successful attorney who'd married a sweet elementary school teacher. At family gatherings, they'd praise his career achievements while I served coffee and cleared plates. "Duncan's cases are so important," his mother Laurel would say, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Corporate law is so complex, I don't know how he manages all that stress." When I mentioned my own work, the reading programs I'd developed, the struggling students I'd helped, the conversation would shift. "Teaching is wonderful," Laurel would say with a patronizing smile. "So selfless, though I suppose it's different from real professional pressure." Duncan never corrected her. He'd just squeeze my hand and change the subject to his latest courtroom victory. The isolation crept in like fog. Friends stopped calling when I canceled plans too many times. "Duncan has a work event," I'd explain, even when he'd simply decided he didn't want to go out. "You know how demanding his job is." My sister Jenna noticed first. "You've gotten so quiet," she said during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. "Remember when you used to tell stories that made everyone cry laughing? When's the last time you did that?" I couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that my stories annoyed Duncan. My laughter was too loud. My enthusiasm was embarrassing. Better to smile quietly and let him entertain the room with his quick wit and legal anecdotes. "He's just particular," I defended when Jenna pressed. "Successful men have standards. Since when do you care about someone else's standards more than your own happiness?" I had no answer for that. Or rather, I had an answer I wasn't ready to admit, since I'd started believing I wasn't worth much without Duncan's approval. The holidays were always Duncan's domain. His family's traditions, his mother's menu, his childhood home where every ornament had a story that predated me. I'd learned to fade into the background during these gatherings, useful for refilling drinks and washing dishes but otherwise invisible. This past Thanksgiving had been particularly brutal. Duncan's brother Ryan brought his new girlfriend, a bubbly marketing executive who charmed everyone instantly. "She's so accomplished," Laurel gushed, "and confident." "Ryan, you've really found someone special." I watched from the kitchen doorway as they fawned over her career achievements, her travel stories, her opinions on everything from wine to politics. When I attempted to join a conversation about the upcoming school board elections, something I actually knew about, Duncan's uncle Armand literally turned his back to me mid-sentence. "Sienna," Duncan called from the living room. "Could you bring more ice? I was their servant, not their guest." And Duncan liked it that way. That night, driving home in silence, I finally spoke up. "Your family treats me like hired help." Duncan's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous. They love you, they love that I clear their plates and pour their wine. They don't actually care what I think or say. Maybe because you never say anything interesting." The words hit like a slap. You sit there looking miserable instead of making an effort. Then you blame everyone else when they don't magically include you in conversations you're not contributing to. I pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, engine running, heat blasting. "I used to be interesting," I said quietly. "I used to have opinions and stories and ideas that people actually wanted to hear." "Yeah, well, people change." Duncan got out, slammed the door, and went inside without looking back. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly happy. Not content, not grateful for what I had, but genuinely, spontaneously happy. The answer frightened me. I couldn't remember. Duncan's breathing evened out beside me, peaceful and undisturbed. He slept like someone with no regrets, no doubts about his place in the world. Meanwhile, I lay awake cataloging all the ways I'd shrunk myself to fit into his life, wondering if there was anything left of the woman I used to be. Christmas was 3 weeks away. Duncan had already made it clear that his family's celebration took priority over any traditions I might want to start. "My mother's been hosting Christmas dinner for 30 years, he'd said when I suggested we alternate holidays between our families. "Why would we change that now?" "Because it might be nice to feel wanted somewhere," I thought, but didn't say. "Because it might be refreshing to spend one holiday where I wasn't treated like an inconvenience." But I'd learned to keep those thoughts to myself. Duncan had trained me well. What I didn't know then was that Christmas dinner would become the moment everything changed. Not because of what Duncan did to me, but because of what I finally decided to do about it. The weeks leading up to Christmas felt like walking through quicksand. Every conversation with Duncan became a minefield where I carefully measured each word, trying to avoid triggering his impatience or contempt. I'd catch myself rehearsing responses to questions he hadn't even asked yet, preparing defenses for accusations that might never come. At school, my colleagues started noticing the change. "Mrs. Spencer, are you feeling all right?" asked Brianna Walters, the kindergarten teacher who shared lunch duty with me. "You seem distant lately." I forced a bright smile. "Just tired. You know how the holidays can be." But it wasn't tiredness, it was the exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself, from living in a state of hypervigilance where every emotion had to be filtered through the question, "Will this annoy Duncan?" My students noticed too. 8-year-old Marcus tugged on my sleeve after reading Circle. "Teacher, why don't you laugh at the funny parts anymore?" His innocent observation hit harder than any of Duncan's cutting remarks. When had I stopped finding joy in the simple things? When had I become so afraid of my own reactions that I'd lost the ability to be spontaneous? The Christmas shopping season became another source of tension.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Duncan criticized every gift idea I suggested for his family. My mother doesn't wear costume jewelry, Sienna. She has standards. Ryan's girlfriend is vegan now. Obviously, you weren't listening when she mentioned it 3 times at Thanksgiving. Uncle Armand already has a whiskey collection worth more than your car. Nothing I chose was right. Nothing I thought of was good enough. I found myself standing in department stores for hours, paralyzed by indecision, knowing that whatever I picked would earn Duncan's disapproval. Meanwhile, he made his own purchases with casual confidence: expensive wine for his father, designer scarves for his mother and sister-in-law, a luxury watch for Ryan. He presented each choice to me like a professor educating a slow student. This is how you show appreciation for quality people, Sienna. You invest in things that reflect their worth. The implication was clear: I wasn't worth the investment. Our own traditions had long since disappeared. The first year we were married, I'd suggested we exchange gifts on Christmas Eve, just the 2 of us, to create our own special moment before the family chaos. Duncan had looked at me like I'd suggested we burn down the house. Why would we need separate gift time? Christmas is about family. You're being selfish. That word selfish became his weapon of choice. Anytime I expressed a preference, a need, or even mild disappointment, I was being selfish. Wanting to visit my sister for New Year's, selfish. Hoping we could stay home one Sunday instead of going to his parents', selfish. Asking him to put his phone away during dinner, incredibly selfish. I began to believe it. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe love meant always putting the other person first, even when that person never returned the favor. The breaking point should have been the work Christmas party. Duncan's law firm threw an elaborate celebration every year at the city's most exclusive hotel. I'd bought a new dress, a deep emerald green that made my eyes shine, and actually felt beautiful for the first time in months. Duncan barely glanced at me when I came downstairs. "You're wearing that?" My confidence crumbled instantly. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing if you're trying to look like you're trying too hard. But whatever, we're already late." At the party, I watched Duncan transform into the charming, attentive man I'd fallen in love with. He was witty and engaging, telling stories that had his colleagues laughing, asking thoughtful questions about their families and careers. The problem was, none of that charm extended to me. When his senior partner complimented my dress, Duncan actually laughed. "She spent 3 hours getting ready. I told her it was just the office party, but you know how women are about these things." I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, carefully composed, quietly smiling, but hollow-eyed. When had I become so afraid of taking up space? Leon Elliott, one of Duncan's colleagues, found me in the hallway on my way back. "Hey, are you okay? You look like you could use some air." His kindness nearly broke me. Here was someone I barely knew showing more concern for my well-being than my own husband had in months. "I'm fine," I lied automatically, "just needed a moment." "For what it's worth," Leon said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "that comment about the dress was uncalled for. You look lovely, and spending time getting ready for something important isn't a character flaw." I thanked him and returned to the party, but his words stayed with me. When was the last time Duncan had complimented how I looked? When was the last time he'd defended me instead of making me the punchline? The drive home was silent until Duncan spoke up. Leon seemed pretty interested in talking to you tonight. There it was, the accusation wrapped in casual observation. He was just being polite. Just make sure you're not giving him the wrong idea. People talk in my office, and I can't afford to have my wife's behavior affecting my reputation. My wife's behavior, as if I'd done something wrong by having a 30-second conversation with his colleague. As if my mere existence was a liability to his precious career. That night, I sat in our bathroom with the door locked, still wearing the emerald dress that had made me feel beautiful for exactly 20 minutes. I caught sight of myself in the mirror again, and realized something that terrified me. I was disappearing. Not all at once, but piece by piece, smile by smile, opinion by opinion. Duncan was erasing me so gradually that even I hadn't noticed how little of myself remained. 3 days later, he announced his plans for Christmas dinner as if they were already decided. Mom's expecting us at 2. She's making the usual prime rib, Yorkshire pudding, all the traditional stuff. Wear something conservative. Okay? Last year's outfit was a bit much for a family gathering. I didn't remember anything being wrong with last year's outfit, but I nodded anyway. That's what I did now. I nodded and smiled and accommodated, because fighting only led to being labeled dramatic, selfish, or worse. But something was stirring in me, small and quiet but persistent. A voice that whispered, "This isn't love. This isn't marriage. This is slow-motion destruction." I wasn't ready to listen to that voice yet, but it was getting harder to ignore. The week before Christmas, Duncan's control tightened like a noose. He began micromanaging everything from my outfit choices to my grocery shopping lists. "We can't have you embarrassing us" became his new favorite phrase, delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. Monday morning, I was getting dressed for work when he appeared in the bedroom doorway, coffee in hand, studying me like a critic examining a disappointing painting. "That sweater makes you look frumpy," he said, not looking up from his phone. "And fix your hair. It looks like you just rolled out of bed." I stared at my reflection. The sweater was soft lavender, one of my favorites. My hair was styled the same way it had been for years. A simple bob that the kids at school said made me look like a princess. But under Duncan's gaze, both suddenly felt wrong. I changed into a black cardigan and pulled my hair back into a severe bun. "Better?" He shrugged. "I suppose." That afternoon, my sister Jenna called while I was grading papers. "Want to grab dinner Friday? There's this new Thai place I've been dying to try." Before I could answer, Duncan materialized beside me. He had this uncanny ability to appear whenever I was on the phone, monitoring my conversations like a security guard. "Friday's not good," I said automatically. "Duncan and I have plans." Duncan raised an eyebrow. We had no plans, but I'd learned that saying yes to social invitations without checking with him first was considered inconsiderate and presumptuous. "You never go out anymore," Jenna said, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "When's the last time we hung out, just us?" I couldn't remember. Duncan had trained me so well that I'd started declining invitations before he even had to discourage them. It was easier than dealing with his sulking, his passive-aggressive comments about my priorities, or his ability to make me pay for any independence I tried to maintain. "I'm just busy with school stuff," I lied. "Maybe after the holidays." After I hung up, Duncan nodded approvingly. "Good. Your sister's always trying to stir up drama anyway." "Jenna? Drama?" My sister was the most level-headed person I knew. But Duncan had a way of reframing everyone in my life as problematic, needy, or potentially harmful to our marriage. My college friends were immature. My work colleagues were gossipy. Even my parents, who lived 3 hours away, were demanding when they asked us to visit. Slowly, systematically, he'd isolated me from every support system I'd ever had. The grocery shopping incident happened Thursday. I'd made a list for Christmas dinner ingredients, thinking I could contribute something to Laurel's meal. Duncan found the list on the kitchen counter and his face darkened. "What's this?" "I thought I could make my grandmother's cranberry sauce recipe. You know, the one with meal. My mother has been making Christmas dinner for 30 years. He cut me off. "Do you really think she needs you to tell her what's missing from her menu?" I wasn't trying to tell her anything. I just thought it would be nice to contribute something meaningful. His laugh was cold. "Sienna, you can barely keep our own kitchen organized. What makes you think you should be bringing experimental recipes to a dinner that matters?" The words hit like physical blows. I looked around our kitchen: clean counters, organized pantry, fresh flowers on the windowsill, and tried to see the chaos he claimed existed there. I couldn't find it. "I'm a good cook," I said quietly, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "When was the last time I defended myself?" "Are you?" Duncan stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back. "Remember the disaster you called salmon last month? I had to order pizza because your fish was inedible. I remembered that night differently. The salmon had been perfectly cooked, but Duncan had criticized it before taking a single bite. "This looks dry," he'd announced, pushing the plate away with theatrical disgust. "I'll just make myself a sandwich." But his version was becoming my reality. That's how gaslighting works. Not with dramatic lies, but with small distortions repeated until you start questioning your own memory, your own senses, your own sanity. "You're right," I heard myself say. "I'll stick to bringing wine." His smile returned. "Good girl. That's more your speed anyway." That evening, I called my mom while Duncan was at the gym. I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who remembered who I used to be. "Sweetheart." Her warm tone immediately brought tears to my eyes. "How are you holding up with all the holiday preparations?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." "You sound different. Quieter. Is everything okay with you and Duncan?" The question hung in the air like a test. I could tell her the truth, about the constant criticism, the isolation, the way I'd learned to shrink myself to avoid conflict. But what would I say? That my husband didn't like my cooking? That he had opinions about my clothes? Put like that, it sounded trivial. Pathetic. "Everything's perfect," I said. "Duncan's just been stressed with work." "Well, you know you can always come home if you need a break. Your room is exactly how you left it." My room. The pale yellow walls covered with photos of friends and achievements. The bookshelf overflowing with novels and poetry collections. The desk where I'd written stories and dreamed of adventures. When was the last time I'd written anything that wasn't a lesson plan or grocery list? "I know, Mom. Thanks." After we hung up, I sat in the silence of our pristine house and tried to imagine going home. But the woman who lived in that yellow room, confident, creative, full of laughter, felt like someone I'd read about in a book. I couldn't figure out how to get back to her. Duncan returned from the gym, energized and talkative. "Great workout," he announced, kissing my forehead like I was a child. "What's for dinner?" I'd been so lost in thought that I hadn't started cooking. The panic was immediate and familiar, the rushing heartbeat, the mental scrambling for excuses, the fear of disappointing him again. "I can make pasta," I offered quickly. "With that sauce you like." "Pasta again? We had Italian food 3 days ago." His good mood evaporated instantly. "Do I need to start planning all our meals myself? Add that to everything else I handle around here?" Everything else he handled. Like what? I paid half the bills. did all the cleaning, managed our social calendar, bought his clothes, scheduled his appointments. But somehow, in Duncan's version of our marriage, he was the one carrying all the weight. "I'll figure something out," I said, already mentally scanning the refrigerator contents. He was scrolling through his phone, already dismissing me. "Order something, and make sure it's from somewhere decent. I can't afford to get food poisoning before the Christmas party at Mom's." As I searched for restaurant delivery options, I caught my reflection in the black phone screen. The woman staring back looked tired, defeated, smaller somehow than she should. I almost didn't recognize her, but recognition was coming, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, because isolation only works if you don't realize what's happening. And after months of careful conditioning, I was finally starting to wake up. Friday morning, December 22nd. The day that changed everything arrived, disguised as ordinary cruelty. I woke up to find Duncan already dressed in his best suit, humming while he adjusted his tie in the mirror. His law firm was hosting their annual client breakfast, and he was presenting a case study that could secure his promotion to senior partner. "Big day," I said, sitting up in bed. "Are you nervous?" "Why would I be nervous?" He shot me a look that suggested the question itself was stupid. "I've been preparing for this for months. Unlike some people, I don't wing it and hope for the best." The dig was unnecessary, but typical. I'd learned not to react to these casual cruelties, but this morning something felt different. Maybe it was the way he preened in front of the mirror, so certain of his own excellence. Maybe it was the dismissive way he'd brushed off my attempt at supportive conversation. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. Duncan paused, his hand halfway to his collar. For a moment I thought he might say something kind in return. Instead he laughed. "Proud of me? Sienna, you grade finger paintings for a living. I'm not sure your opinion on professional achievement carries much weight." The words landed like a physical blow. I'd been teaching for 8 years, had helped dozens of struggling children learn to read, had developed programs that other schools now used as models. But in Duncan's world, my work was finger painting. Trivial, worthless. "That's not fair," I whispered. "Fair?" He turned from the mirror, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Since when is stating facts unfair? You work with children because you can't handle adult responsibilities. There's nothing wrong with that. Someone has to do the simple jobs. But let's not pretend it's something it's not." I sat there in our bed, wearing the pajamas he'd bought me because my own were too childish, in the bedroom we decorated entirely to his taste, listening to him systematically demolish my sense of worth before 8 a.m. "I help children learn to read," I said, my voice barely audible. "I change lives." "You babysit." His tone was patient now, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. "And that's fine, Sienna. Not everyone can be ambitious. Someone has to be content with mediocrity." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and don't wait up tonight. The partners are going out after the presentation to celebrate. It'll probably be late." The front door slammed, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and a silence that felt like drowning. I called in sick to school. I couldn't face my students, those bright, eager faces that lit up when they sounded out a new word or solved a problem they'd been struggling with. How could I teach them they were capable of anything, when I'd just been told my life's work was glorified babysitting? Instead, I wandered through our house like a ghost. In the living room I noticed the bookshelf where my teaching awards used to sit. Duncan had moved them to make room for his law journals months ago. Clutter, he'd called them. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet where I used to keep my recipe books, the ones filled with margin notes and family stories. They were gone, replaced by Duncan's collection of expensive cooking gadgets he never used but liked to display. Even my grandmother's china, which had been wedding gifts to us both, had been relegated to the highest shelf because Duncan preferred his mother's modern dinnerware for entertainment. I'd been erased from my own home, so gradually I hadn't noticed it happening. At 3 p.m., my phone rang. Jenna's name flashed on the screen. "Sienna, Mrs. Patterson called me. She said you called in sick, but you didn't sound sick, just upset. Are you okay?" Mrs. Patterson was the school secretary, and Jenna's neighbor. In a small town, everyone looked out for everyone, even when you didn't realize you needed looking out for. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "No, you're not. I'm coming over." "Jenna, don't, I'm already in my car." 20 minutes later, my sister stood in my living room, taking in my tear-streaked face and ratty sweatshirt with the expression of someone who'd finally confirmed their worst suspicions. "Talk," she said, settling onto the couch beside me. And for the first time in months, I did. The words poured out. Duncan's constant criticism, the way he'd isolated me from friends, how he made me feel stupid and worthless and small. I told her about the work comment that morning, about how he'd stripped away every piece of my identity until I didn't know who I was anymore. Jenna listened without interrupting, her face growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sienna," she said finally, "what you're describing is abuse." "No." The denial was instant, automatic. "He doesn't hit me. He's never even raised his voice, really. He's just particular about things. Emotional abuse is still abuse, psychological abuse still abuse." She turned to face me fully. "He's systematically destroyed your self-esteem, isolated you from your support system, and convinced you that your thoughts and feelings don't matter. That's not being particular, that's being abusive." The word hung between us like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Abuse, such an ugly word, something that happened to other women in dramatic, obvious ways. Not something that crept in wearing the mask of helpful suggestions and loving concern. "I don't know how to leave," I whispered, the admission surprising us both. "You don't have to figure it all out today," Jenna said, taking my hand. "But you do have to start somewhere. What would make you feel strong again? What would make you feel like yourself?" I thought about the question seriously for the first time in years. "I used to write," I said slowly, "stories, poems. I used to have opinions about books and movies and politics. I used to laugh at my own jokes. So start there. Start remembering who you were before Duncan convinced you that woman wasn't worth anything." That evening, Duncan came home late as promised, smelling like expensive whiskey and someone else's perfume. He was in an excellent mood, the presentation had gone perfectly, the partners had praised his work, his promotion was all but guaranteed. "Great day," he announced, loosening his tie. Sometimes I amaze even myself. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, this man who'd spent the morning destroying my confidence and the evening celebrating his own success. For the first time I saw him clearly, not as the accomplished husband I was lucky to have, but as a small, insecure person who could only feel big by making others feel small. "How was your day?" he asked, not looking at me. "Did you manage to handle being alone without falling apart?" "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months, "I had a very enlightening day." Something in my tone made him look up. "Oh, learn any exciting kindergarten facts?" I smiled, and for once it wasn't forced. "Something like that." That night, after Duncan fell asleep, I pulled out an old notebook from the back of my closet. The pages were yellowed and the cover was worn, but it had been mine once, filled with my thoughts and dreams and words. I opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Day 1. I didn't know what I was starting, but I knew I was finally ready to start." The notebook became my lifeline. Hidden beneath a stack of lesson plans in my desk drawer at school, it held the fragments of myself I was slowly piecing back together. Every day, I wrote down one thing Duncan said that made me feel small, one memory of who I used to be, one tiny observation about the world that was entirely my own. December 23rd. He told me my laugh was too loud at the grocery store when I was talking to Mrs. Chen about her granddaughter's Christmas pageant. I used to love making people smile. When did my joy become something to be ashamed of? December 24th. Found my old poetry collection in a box in the garage. Duncan must have moved it there. Read Still I Rises, and cried. Maya Angelou understood something about rising that I'm just starting to remember. December 26th. Watched the way he talked to the server at dinner. Same condescending tone he uses with me. Same assumption that other people exist to serve him. I used to tip well because I knew how hard service work was. When did I stop caring about kindness? The writing was like physical therapy for a muscle I'd forgotten I had. Slowly, painfully, my own voice started emerging from underneath the layers of Duncan's expectations and corrections. I began paying attention to things I'd trained myself to ignore, like how Duncan never asked about my day, unless he was setting up a criticism, how he monopolized conversations at social gatherings, interrupting me if I tried to contribute anything substantial, how he made decisions about our life, where to vacation, which friends to see, how to spend holidays, without consulting me, then acted like my compliance was willing agreement rather than learned helplessness. At school, I started really listening to my students again. 8-year-old Emma brought me a drawing of her family, including their new puppy. I love how happy everyone looks, I told her, and meant it. My daddy says happiness is the most important thing, Emma replied, coloring in the puppy's spots with intense concentration. He says if someone makes you sad all the time, that's not love. Out of the mouths of babes. I stared at Emma's drawing, stick figures with enormous smiles, a house with flowers in every window, a sun that took up half the sky, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd drawn, or even thought about happiness as a goal rather than a luxury. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I went to the public library alone. Duncan always criticized how I spent my free time. Reading was antisocial, browsing was aimless, and libraries were depressing. But sitting in the quiet stacks, surrounded by thousands of stories and ideas, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. I checked out 3 books, a novel about a woman starting over after divorce, a collection of essays about female friendship, and a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Stanton with kind eyes and silver hair, smiled as she scanned my selections. Excellent choices, she said quietly. Sometimes we need to read about other women's courage to remember our own. Did she know? Could she see something in my face that revealed what I was going through? I nodded, not trusting my voice, and hurried home to hide the books before Duncan returned from work. That evening, while Duncan watched television and scrolled through his phone, I read in the bathroom with the door locked. The novel's protagonist was leaving her husband after 20 years of marriage, and her internal monologue felt like reading my own thoughts. I had become so small, so careful, so afraid of disrupting his peace, that I had forgotten I deserved peace too. I had to stop reading. The recognition was too sharp, too immediate. On New Year's Eve, Duncan announced we'd be attending his law firm's party at the country club. Wear the navy dress, he instructed while shaving. And do something with your hair, maybe that style his mother likes, more sophisticated, less elementary school teacher. I stood in front of my closet, staring at the navy dress he'd chosen. It was conservative, boring, the kind of outfit that made me invisible rather than attractive. In the back, pushed behind clothes I never wore anymore, I found an emerald green dress I'd bought years ago. It was elegant but striking, the color perfect for my skin tone. I'd worn it once to a work Christmas party, and felt beautiful all evening. What do you think? I asked Duncan, emerging from the bedroom in the green dress. His face darkened immediately. I told you to wear the navy. I know, but I thought this might be nice for a change. It's been hanging there for. Are you trying to embarrass me? His voice was sharp now, the pleasant mood evaporating. I specifically told you what to wear, because I know what's appropriate for my colleagues. But apparently, you think you know better. The old me would have apologized and changed immediately. The woman who'd been keeping a secret notebook and reading books about courage in bathroom stalls made a different choice. I like this dress, I said quietly. It makes me feel pretty. Pretty? Duncan's laugh was cruel. Sienna, you're 34 years old. Pretty is for women who don't have to work for respect. You need to look serious, professional, like someone worth taking seriously. Maybe I am someone worth taking seriously. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Neither of us had expected. Duncan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something I'd never seen before: uncertainty. He wasn't sure how to handle a version of me that pushed back. Fine, he said finally. Wear whatever you want. But don't blame me when people whisper about how my wife dresses like she's trying to relive her 20s. At the party, something miraculous happened. People complimented my dress. 3 different partners' wives told me the color was beautiful. Leon Elliott, Duncan's colleague who'd been kind to me before, said I looked radiant. The young associates' spouses wanted to know where I'd bought it. Duncan stood beside me with increasing tension, watching his narrative crumble. According to his version of reality, I was supposed to look inappropriate and receive criticism that would teach me to trust his judgment. Instead, I was getting the positive attention he'd trained me to believe I didn't deserve. During the cocktail hour, I found myself in conversation with Brianna Walters, who I discovered was Leon's wife. She was a veterinarian with her own practice, funny and warm, and genuinely interested in my teaching work. Duncan always talks about how stressful his job is, she said, sipping her wine, but honestly, I think teaching is harder. At least Leon's clients can communicate what they need in complete sentences. I laughed. My real laugh. The one Duncan said was too loud, and felt something unlock inside my chest. When was the last time someone had valued my work? When was the last time I'd been seen as competent rather than tolerated? I love it, I heard myself say. Even the difficult days. There's something magical about watching a child understand something new. That's exactly how Leon talks about his pro bono cases. You can see the passion in your face when you talk about teaching. That's beautiful. Beautiful. Not embarrassing or inappropriate or too much. Beautiful. On the drive home, Duncan was quiet until we pulled into our driveway. You seem to enjoy yourself tonight. I did, I said honestly. It was nice to talk to people about things I care about. He sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. Just remember that these are my colleagues, Sienna. My reputation matters here. I can't have you getting too comfortable and saying something inappropriate. There it was. The warning wrapped in concern, the reminder that I was still on probation in my own life. But as I got ready for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was wearing a green dress that made her eyes shine, and for the first time in years, she looked like someone with secrets. Good secrets. Powerful secrets. Secrets about a notebook full of her own thoughts, and books hidden in her car, and the slowly growing certainty that she deserved better than this. I was still married to Duncan Spencer. I still lived in his house and followed his rules and smiled when he diminished me. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who had written day 1 in a secret notebook was starting to plan for day 2 and day 3, and all the days that would follow. The woman who had forgotten how to dream was remembering. And that woman was dangerous. January brought a cold snap that froze the pipes in our basement and mirrored the chill settling between Duncan and me. But where the house's coldness was an inconvenience, mine was strategic. I'd learned to observe rather than react, to document rather than defend. The notebook had evolved from therapeutic writing into something more systematic. I started recording dates, times, witnesses present during Duncan's worst moments. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its predictability. January 8th, 7:30 p.m., called me financially irresponsible for buying coffee at school when there's coffee at home. Did this in front of the Johnsons when they came for dinner. Made sure to mention it 3 separate times throughout the evening. Each time with a laugh like it was charming instead of humiliating. January 12th, 2:15 p.m. Criticized my lesson plans while I was grading at the kitchen table. Said elementary education was for people who gave up on real teaching. When I mentioned my master's degree in education, he said community college doesn't count as real graduate school. I went to state university, not community college. He knows this. The lies were what shocked me most. Not just the way Duncan rewrote our arguments to make himself the victim, but how casually he distorted basic facts about my life. My education, my family, my achievements, all of it got filtered through his need to position himself as superior. I started paying attention to how he talked about me to others when he thought I wasn't listening. Standing in grocery store aisles, I'd overhear him on phone calls with his mother. Sienna's having one of her emotional days again. You know how sensitive she gets about everything. Emotional days. As if my responses to his cruelty were character flaws, rather than normal human reactions to being systematically diminished. At school, I found myself studying the dynamics in my classroom with new eyes. When Tyler, a particularly aggressive 8-year-old, tried to dominate group activities by putting down other children's ideas, I recognized the behavior immediately. The way he positioned himself as the smartest person in the room. The casual cruelty disguised as helpful observations. The assumption that his comfort mattered more than anyone else's feelings. Tyler, I said gently during one particularly harsh exchange, where he'd told Emma her drawing was baby stuff. How do you think Emma felt when you said that? He shrugged, not making eye contact. I was just being honest. Honesty without kindness is just cruelty, I replied. The words coming from somewhere deep and certain. Being right doesn't give you permission to be mean. Later I wrote that phrase in my notebook and underlined it twice. How many times had Duncan used honesty as an excuse for unnecessary harshness? How many times had I accepted just being truthful as justification for treatment that left me feeling worthless? The breakthrough came during a faculty meeting in late January. Our principal, Mrs. Elliot, no relation to Leon, was discussing new anti-bullying protocols when she said something that stopped me cold. Often it's more subtle, isolating someone from their peer group, making them doubt their own perceptions, using their insecurities against them. The most dangerous bullies are the ones who convince their victims that the abuse is normal. I sat in that fluorescent-lit conference room, surrounded by my colleagues taking notes about protecting children, and realized I was living with the adult version of everything we were being trained to recognize and stop. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my college roommate, Laurel Stanton. We'd lost touch after I married Duncan, partly because of distance, but mostly because he'd made it clear he found her exhausting and immature. Sienna. Her voice was warm with surprise. Oh my God, I was just thinking about you. How are you? How's married life? The question hung in the air. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot after staying late to avoid going home, and the honest answer felt too big for a phone call. It's complicated, I said finally. Complicated how? Is Duncan still as intense as he was in college? Intense. I'd forgotten that's how my friends had seen him when we were dating. Not confident or driven. Intense. Controlling. Several of them had tried to warn me, gently, about how he monopolized my time and criticized my choices. I'd dismissed their concerns as jealousy. Laurel, I said carefully, do you remember what you said at my engagement party? About being worried. A pause. You mean when I asked if you were sure he made you happy? When I said he seemed to need you to be smaller than you were? I'd forgotten that conversation. Or maybe I'd deliberately buried it. Yeah, that, Sienna. Are you okay? You sound different, sadder. I think, I said slowly, I might need help figuring some things out. Whatever you need, she said immediately. I'm here. I've always been here. After we hung up, I sat in the January darkness and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that Duncan would change, but the practical hope that maybe I could. When I finally went inside, Duncan was in his office, door closed, on a conference call that sounded more like drinks with friends than work. I could hear him laughing, relaxed and charming in a way he never was with me anymore. I made dinner quietly, ate alone, and went to bed early. But before I turned off the light, I wrote one more entry in my notebook. January 28th, called Laurel. Remembered that other people used to think I was worth protecting. Remembered that I used to think so too. Below that, I wrote something that felt like a prayer or a promise. The woman who loved herself enough to choose this marriage is still in here somewhere. It's time to find her again. I was still afraid, still trapped in a life that felt too small and too cruel. But I was no longer alone with my thoughts. And I was no longer accepting Duncan's version of reality as the only truth. The shadow phase wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about gathering strength in the darkness, preparing for the moment when I'd be ready to step back into the light. That moment was coming. I could feel it approaching, like spring after a long winter, inevitable, necessary, and closer than it appeared. February arrived with a thaw that made everything feel possible. While ice melted from our windows, I began building the foundation for a life Duncan couldn't control. The process was painstaking, requiring the kind of careful planning I'd once reserved for lesson plans and birthday parties. Laurel became my lifeline. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I'd call her during my lunch break, sitting in my car with the engine running for warmth. She never pushed for details I wasn't ready to share, but she listened with the fierce attention of someone who'd been waiting years for this conversation. I need to understand my finances, I told her during one of these calls. I don't even know what we have or where it's kept. Duncan handles everything. That's by design, Laurel said gently. She worked in financial planning now, helping divorced women rebuild their economic independence. Financial control is abuse 101. Let's start simple. Do you have access to any accounts in your own name? I did a mental inventory. My teaching salary went into our joint checking account. Duncan managed our savings, investments, and credit cards. I had one credit card with my name on it, but he reviewed the statements monthly, questioning every purchase. Not really, I admitted. Everything goes through him. Okay, we're going to change that, but carefully. First, you need your own documentation. Birth certificate, social security card, passport if you have one. Where does Duncan keep important papers? In a filing cabinet in his office. It's always locked. When does he leave it unlocked? I thought about Duncan's routines. He was obsessively organized but also arrogant about his control. Sunday mornings when he's in the shower, he unlocks it Saturday night to review bills and leaves it open until after his workout. Perfect. This Sunday, You're going to photocopy everything with your name on it. Birth certificate, social security card, marriage certificate, insurance papers, tax returns. Use the school copier if you have to. Store the copies somewhere he'll never look. That Sunday, while Duncan showered and sang off-key show tunes, I rifled through his filing system with my heart hammering against my ribs. Everything was labeled in his precise handwriting. Insurance, taxes 2023, property deeds, investment statements. I found my documents in a folder labeled Sienna's papers, as if my identity was just another category in his organizational system. Birth certificate, social security card, passport, even my college transcripts. All of it locked away, like evidence in a case I didn't know was being built against me. I photographed everything with my phone, hand shaking slightly. In a folder marked joint accounts, I discovered financial statements I'd never seen. Our savings account had significantly more money than I'd realized. Duncan had been telling me we needed to be careful with spending while sitting on nearly $40,000. The investment portfolio was even more shocking. Stocks, bonds, a retirement account I didn't know existed. All in both our names but managed entirely by him. We weren't struggling financially. We were comfortable, even well off. But Duncan had maintained the fiction of scarcity to control my spending, my choices, my sense of what was possible. I found something else in that folder. A life insurance policy on me, taken out 2 years ago. The beneficiary was Duncan, and the payout was substantial enough to make my hands tremble as I photographed the documents. Tuesday, I called a number Laurel had given me. Legal Aid Society, a service for people who couldn't afford private attorneys. The intake counselor was kind but matter-of-fact. "I'm not sure I'm ready to leave yet," I explained, "but I want to understand my options." "Smart," she said. "Knowledge is power. Can you come in for a consultation? We have evening hours for people who can't get away during the day." I scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday, telling Duncan I had a faculty meeting about new state testing requirements. The lie came so easily it scared me. Insone. Attorney Sarah Walters was younger than I'd expected, with tired eyes and a warm smile. She listened to my abbreviated story without judgment, taking notes in careful shorthand. "You're describing financial abuse, emotional abuse, and isolation tactics," she said when I finished. "The good news is that in this state, marital assets are split equitably regardless of who managed them during the marriage. The bad news is that psychological abuse is harder to prove than physical abuse. I've been keeping records," I said, showing her my notebook. Her eyes lit up. "This is excellent. Dates, specific incidents, witnesses when possible. Keep doing this. Also, document any financial restrictions he places on you. And Sienna," she looked at me seriously, "start building your own safety net. Nothing dramatic, nothing he'll notice, but you need resources that are entirely yours." The next day, I opened a savings account at a different bank, using my maiden name and my school address. I started depositing small amounts, $20 here, $50 there, money I saved by bringing lunch instead of buying it, by walking instead of driving short distances, by claiming I'd lost receipts for purchases I never made. I also began what I privately called insurance collecting. I took photos of our house, our possessions, our important documents. I made copies of my teaching certificates and stored them at school. I started keeping a bag in my car with a change of clothes, basic toiletries, and photocopies of crucial papers. Most importantly, I started rebuilding my support network. I reached out to colleagues I'd distanced myself from, accepted invitations I would have previously declined, volunteered for after-school activities that gave me legitimate reasons to be away from home. Jenna noticed the changes first. You seem lighter, she said during a coffee date I'd actually kept. Different. More like yourself. I'm trying to remember who that is, I admitted. She's pretty wonderful, Jenna said, squeezing my hand. I've missed her. Duncan noticed changes too, but he interpreted them differently. My growing confidence registered as defiance, my improved mood seemed to threaten him. He began micromanaging my schedule more closely, questioning where I'd been and why I seemed distant. You're acting strange lately, he said one evening, studying me over dinner. Secretive. Is there something you want to tell me? Like what? I asked, cutting my chicken with steady hands. I don't know. You just seem different. Are you happy in this marriage, Sienna? The question felt like a trap, but for once, I wasn't afraid of it. Are you asking because you're concerned about my happiness, or because you're worried about losing control? His fork paused halfway to his mouth. What kind of question is that? An honest one. We stared at each other across the table, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, something deeper, fear. He was starting to realize that the woman he'd carefully molded was becoming someone he couldn't predict or control. I think, he said, carefully, we should talk about seeing a counselor, to work on our communication. I nodded, knowing that Duncan's version of couples therapy would be another attempt to fix what he saw as my defiance. But I also knew something he didn't. I was no longer the woman who could be convinced that her own thoughts were wrong. The arsenal was nearly complete. Soon, I'd be ready to use it. March brought an unexpected challenge. Duncan suggested couples therapy, but not because he recognized any problems with his behavior. He'd found a therapist who specialized in helping wives adjust to successful marriages, Dr. Ryan Elliott, a man whose website featured testimonials from grateful husbands whose difficult wives had learned to be more supportive. I think it would be good for us, Duncan announced over breakfast, sliding a printed page across the table. Dr. Elliott comes highly recommended. He helps couples work through communication issues. I scanned the therapist's credentials and philosophy. Every red flag imaginable was there. Focus on traditional gender roles, emphasis on supporting your husband's success, language about women learning to manage their emotions more effectively. This looks great, I said, my voice carefully neutral. When can we start? Duncan's satisfied smile told me everything I needed to know. He expected Dr. Elliott to fix me, to return me to the compliant woman I'd been. What he didn't realize was that I'd become an excellent actress. Our first session was scheduled for a Thursday evening. I spent the previous week preparing like it was the performance of my life. I studied Duncan's patterns, his preferred narratives about our marriage, the specific ways he liked to present himself as the long-suffering but devoted husband. Dr. Elliott's office was exactly what I'd expected: leather furniture, diplomas prominently displayed, books about masculine leadership and feminine submission lined up on oak shelves. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested he'd never questioned his own assumptions about anything. So, he began, settling back in his chair with a legal pad. Duncan tells me you've been going through some changes lately. Becoming more assertive. I glanced at Duncan, who nodded encouragingly, clearly expecting me to confess my recent defiance, so the good doctor could help me overcome it. I've been trying to be a better wife, I said softly, playing the role Duncan expected. But sometimes I think I fail at understanding what Duncan needs from me. Dr. Elliott nodded approvingly. That's very mature of you to recognize, Sienna. Many women struggle with this. Tell me, what specific areas do you feel you're falling short in? For the next 50 minutes, I performed the role of the confused, well-intentioned wife who just needed guidance to better support her husband. I spoke about my tendency to overthink things and my struggle with being too emotional. I asked for advice on how to be more grateful for Duncan's hard work and success. Duncan sat beside me, practically glowing with vindication. This was exactly the narrative he'd hoped for. Me acknowledging my flaws while he played the patient, loving husband trying to help me grow. Dr. Elliot ate it up. Duncan, you're very fortunate to have a wife who's willing to work on herself. Sienna, I can see you love your husband very much. Sometimes we women get so caught up in our feelings that we forget our husbands need our support, not our criticism. That's exactly what I've been trying to tell her, Duncan said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. She's so smart, but sometimes that intelligence turns into overthinking every little thing. Intelligence in women needs to be channeled properly, Dr. Elliot agreed. It's wonderful that you're a teacher, Sienna. Working with children is perfect for the nurturing female spirit. But at home, your husband needs to be the leader. Your job is to trust his judgment and support his decisions. I nodded earnestly, taking mental notes for the conversation I'd be having with attorney Sarah Walters the following week. Every word out of Dr. Elliot's mouth was gold for documenting the kind of environment Duncan was trying to maintain in our marriage. The drive home was the most relaxed I'd seen Duncan in months. That went really well, he said, one hand on the steering wheel, the other reaching over to pat my knee. Dr. Elliot seems to understand exactly what we're dealing with. He does, I agreed. I learned a lot today. I had learned something, but not what Duncan thought. I'd learned that he was so invested in his version of reality that he'd pay a professional to validate it. I'd learned that he genuinely believed the problem in our marriage was my failure to properly appreciate his superiority. And I'd learned that he was so confident in his control that he wasn't watching for signs that I might be playing a deeper game. Over the next few weeks, I became the wife Duncan had always wanted me to be. I stopped questioning his decisions. I praised his insights. I deferred to his judgment on everything from dinner plans to weekend activities. When he made disparaging comments about my work or my family, I nodded thoughtfully instead of defending myself. "You seem much more relaxed lately," he observed one evening while I massaged his shoulders. "Dr. Elliot is really helping you, isn't it?" "It's helping me understand my role better," I said, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. At our second therapy session, Dr. Elliot praised my progress. "Sienna has made remarkable improvements in just 2 weeks. She's learning to let Duncan lead without resistance. I'm trying to trust his judgment more," I said, looking adoringly at my husband. "He's so much better at seeing the big picture." Duncan preened under the attention. After the session, he suggested we celebrate at his favorite restaurant, the expensive one where he liked to be seen by his colleagues. "I'm proud of you," he said over wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. "I know it's not easy to admit when you need to change, but you're really making an effort." "I just want us to be happy," I replied, and meant it more than he could know, because my version of happiness was very different from his. While Duncan thought he was watching me transform into his ideal wife, I was actually documenting every session, every condescending comment, every moment where his true character was revealed. The notebook I kept hidden at school was filling up with therapy quotes, financial discoveries, and a growing timeline of psychological manipulation. I was building a case not just for divorce, but for my own sanity, proof that I wasn't the dramatic, oversensitive woman Duncan had convinced me I was. Most importantly, I was learning to wear masks as skillfully as he did. If Duncan could present himself as the perfect husband while systematically destroying my self-worth, I could present myself as the grateful wife, while systematically planning my escape. The performance was exhausting, but it was also empowering. For the first time in our marriage, I was the one with secrets. I was the one controlling the narrative, and unlike Duncan's version of control, mine had an expiration date. April brought unseasonably warm weather, and Duncan's biggest case of the year. The Armand Corporation merger would either make his career or end his partnership track, and the stress was making him careless in ways that served my purposes perfectly. Late nights at the office became his norm, but I'd learned to use his absences strategically. While he worked on billion-dollar deals, I worked on my own form of due diligence, discovering exactly who I'd married and what he'd been hiding. The breakthrough came when Duncan left his laptop open during one of his marathon work sessions. He'd gone to shower at 2 a.m., exhausted and running on nothing but caffeine and ambition. The screensaver hadn't activated yet, and his email was open. What I found made my blood run cold. Thread after thread of conversations with his law school buddy Armand Stanton, now a partner at a rival firm. They weren't discussing legal strategy or client referrals. They were rating women, sharing photos from dating apps, discussing conquests like teenage boys with expensive degrees. Marriage is the ultimate long con, Duncan had written in a message dated just 6 months after our wedding. Find someone grateful enough to think they're lucky to have you, and you've got a built-in maid, chef, and cheerleader who pays half the bills. I scrolled further back, my hands trembling. Message after message revealed a version of Duncan I'd never seen, cruel, calculating, utterly without affection for me or our marriage. Sienna's getting a little too comfortable lately. Read a message from last Christmas. Might need to remind her how good she has it. Women forget their place if you don't keep them grateful. Have you tried the silent treatment? Armand had responded. Works every time. Make them think they've done something wrong. Let them twist themselves into knots apologizing for things they didn't even do. Classic psychological control. The conversation continued with detailed strategies for keeping wives in line, financial restrictions, social isolation, systematic erosion of self-esteem. They discussed it like a game, sharing techniques they'd learned from their fathers, from self-help books about dominance, from online forums I didn't want to imagine. But the worst discovery was yet to come. In a folder marked insurance, I found email exchanges with our insurance agent about increasing my life insurance policy. Duncan had tripled the coverage just last year, citing my dangerous commute and family history of heart problems, neither of which were true. Just want to make sure my wife is properly covered, he'd written. You never know what could happen. I photographed everything with shaking hands, my teacher's steady nerves finally failing me. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was a man who'd systematically planned my psychological distress and was now positioning himself to benefit financially from my death. The shower was still running. I had maybe 5 more minutes before Duncan returned. I scrolled through his recent searches, finding articles about accidental deaths, undetectable poisons, and making suicide look convincing. My vision started to blur. I was going to be sick. But first, I needed evidence. I forwarded the most damaging emails to my secret account, deleted them from his sent folder, and cleared his browser history. Then I closed the laptop, walked calmly to the guest bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left. When Duncan emerged from the shower 20 minutes later, humming and relaxed, I was in bed pretending to read. He kissed my forehead like a loving husband, told me about his stressful day, and fell asleep within minutes. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and processing what I'd learned. I wasn't married to someone who was simply selfish or controlling. I was married to someone who was actively dangerous. The next morning, I called in sick to school for the second time all year. Instead of lesson planning, I drove to Sarah Walter's office with printed copies of everything I'd found. Jesus Christ, she whispered, reading through the emails. Sienna, this is evidence of premeditation, not just for divorce, but for potential criminal charges. He's planning to kill me, isn't he? The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. I think he's at least considering it as an option. The insurance policy changes, the internet searches, this shows intent to harm. We need to involve law enforcement. But I took these illegally. From his private computer. The evidence might not be admissible in court, but it's enough to get a protective order and start a criminal investigation. Sienna, you're not safe in that house. For the first time since January, I felt true terror, not the low-level anxiety that had become my constant companion, but sharp, immediate fear for my life. I can't leave yet, I said. If I disappear suddenly, he'll know I found something. He's too smart not to realize what happened. Sarah studied me carefully. What are you thinking? I need more evidence. Something that doesn't require illegal computer access. Something that shows his true character in a way that can't be disputed. That's incredibly dangerous. Everything is dangerous now, but if I'm going to survive this, I need to be smarter than he is. Sarah nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Help me plan an exit strategy that doesn't get me killed, and help me gather evidence that will make sure he can never do this to anyone else. We spent the next 2 hours developing a safety plan that felt like plotting a covert operation. Emergency contacts, safe houses, evidence collection protocols, communication strategies that wouldn't raise Duncan's suspicions. When I left Sarah's office, I had a new mission. I needed to become the perfect wife long enough to gather the evidence that would destroy the perfect husband. The performance wasn't just about divorce anymore. It was about survival, and for the first time since I'd discovered Duncan's true nature, I felt something stronger than fear. He thought he was hunting me, but now, finally, I was hunting him back. December crept in like a predator, each day bringing Christmas closer, and Duncan's mood darker. The Armand Corporation case had concluded successfully, earning him the promotion he'd craved, but instead of satisfaction, success seemed to feed his need for control. His behavior escalated in ways that made my hidden evidence feel both more crucial and more dangerous to collect. He'd started monitoring my movements more closely, questioning every minute I was away from home. My teaching schedule became subject to his approval. Even grocery shopping required detailed explanations of where I'd gone and why it had taken so long. You seem distracted lately, he said one evening, watching me grade papers at the kitchen table. Like your mind is somewhere else. Just thinking about Christmas, I replied, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. Your family always does such beautiful celebrations. His mother Laurel had already called 3 times that week about Christmas dinner arrangements. The Spencer family tradition was sacred. Christmas Eve at the country club for their annual party, Christmas Day at the family estate, for dinner and gift exchange. As always, my role was to smile, serve and stay invisible. Mom wants you to handle the table settings this year, Duncan said casually. She thinks it's time you took on more responsibility for family events. More responsibility, translation, more opportunities to be criticized for not meeting Laurel's exacting standards. But this year, I had a different perspective on Christmas dinner. This year, it might be my last performance as Duncan's wife. I'd been working with Sarah to plan what she called the documentation event, a situation where Duncan's true nature would be revealed in front of witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or discredited. Christmas dinner, with his entire family present, offered the perfect opportunity. I'd be honored, I told Duncan, and meant it more than he could know. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into Christmas preparations with an enthusiasm that delighted Duncan and puzzled his mother. I researched table settings, studied proper etiquette, Learned the family's preferences for everything from napkin colors to flower arrangements. She's really embracing her role this year, I heard Laurel tell Duncan during one of their phone conversations. I think that therapy is working. Dr. Elliot had indeed declared our sessions a success. In his professional opinion, I'd learned to channel my intelligence into supporting my husband rather than challenging him. Duncan was so pleased with this assessment that he'd given me his credit card to buy something special for Christmas dinner. My outfit, he specified, should reflect my growth as a wife. I bought a dress that was everything Duncan admired. Conservative, expensive, the kind of outfit that whispered successful man's grateful wife. What he didn't know was that I'd also bought something else that day. A small digital recording device that could be sewn into clothing and controlled remotely via smartphone app. Sarah had been reluctant to approve this plan. If he finds it, if he realizes what you're doing, he won't, I said with more confidence than I felt. Duncan's arrogance is his weakness. He's so convinced that he's in control that he's stopped watching for threats. The device was smaller than a button, virtually undetectable when sewn into the dress's inner seam. I'd practiced activating it until I could start recording with a casual gesture, checking my phone in a way that looked like normal social media scrolling. But technology was only part of the plan. The real strategy involved psychological warfare, using Duncan's need for admiration and control to expose his true character in front of his family. I began planting seeds weeks before Christmas, casual comments to Laurel about how proud I was of Duncan's success. Mentions to his brother Ryan about how Duncan always knew exactly what was best for our marriage. Little observations to Uncle Armand about how lucky I felt to have such a strong husband to guide me. You've really found your place in this family, Laurel observed during one of our planning calls. Duncan has always needed someone who appreciated his gifts. He's taught me so much about what a real marriage should look like, I replied, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. The irony was perfect. By playing the role of the grateful, submissive wife, I was positioning myself as the innocent victim that Duncan's family would want to protect once they saw who he really was. Christmas Eve at the country club went exactly as expected. Duncan held court among his colleagues, charming and brilliant and utterly convinced of his own superiority. I played my part perfectly. The admiring wife who laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, and made him look like the successful family man he pretended to be. She's so supportive, I heard one of the partners' wives tell Laurel. You can tell how much she adores him. He's trained her well, Laurel replied, not realizing how revealing that comment was. But Christmas Eve was just rehearsal. Christmas Day would be the main event. I went to bed that night with my dress hanging in the closet, the recording device carefully hidden within its seams. My phone was charged and ready. The evidence I'd collected over months was stored safely with Sarah, ready to be deployed if needed. Duncan lay beside me, peaceful and unsuspecting, probably dreaming about his perfect Christmas dinner where his perfect wife would serve his perfect family and confirm his perfect status as head of household. He had no idea that tomorrow's dinner would be his last performance too. Tomorrow, in front of everyone who mattered to him, Duncan Spencer would reveal exactly who he really was, and I would make sure it was recorded for posterity. The trap was set, now I just had to survive springing it. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of day that made everything look perfect from the outside. Duncan woke up energized, practically bouncing as he showered and dressed in his favorite burgundy sweater, the one that made him look distinguished, he said, like a man who had everything under control. Big day, he announced, checking his reflection one final time. Mom's expecting us early to help with setup. I was already dressed in the navy blue dress he'd approved, the hidden recording device a barely perceptible weight against my ribs. I'm excited, I said, and it was true, though not for the reasons he imagined. The Spencer family estate looked like something from a holiday movie, wreaths on every window, twinkling lights wound through bare tree branches, smoke curling from the massive stone chimney. Laurel had outdone herself, as always, creating the kind of Christmas tableau that would photograph beautifully for the family's social media presence. "Darling," Laurel swept toward us as we entered, already dressed in her signature pearls and an emerald green dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Perfect timing. "Sienna, the table linens are in the dining room. I trust you remember everything we discussed about the proper placement." "Of course," I said, accepting the air kiss she offered. "I've been practicing." What I'd actually been practicing was much more complex than table settings, but Laurel didn't need to know that. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of domestic theater. I arranged china and crystal while Laurel supervised with the intensity of a military commander. Duncan held court in the living room with his father and Uncle Armand, their voices carrying through the house as they discussed politics and Ryan arrived with his girlfriend Jenna, a sweet marketing executive who always seemed slightly overwhelmed by the Spencer family dynamics. She sought me out in the kitchen while I was arranging appetizers. "You look lovely," she said, helping me transfer canapés to serving platters. "That dress is beautiful on you." "Thank you." Duncan picked it out. Something flickered across her face, a brief expression of confusion or concern. "He picks out your clothes. He has excellent taste," I replied smoothly. "I trust his judgment." Jenna opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. But I caught her watching me more carefully after that, noting the way I deferred to Duncan's preferences, the way I asked his permission before accepting a glass of wine, the way I immediately stopped talking whenever he entered a room. Good. I needed witnesses who were paying attention. Dinner was called at exactly 2 o'clock. The dining room looked magazine perfect, every detail executed flawlessly under Laurel's supervision. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, the centerpiece of white roses and holly created elegant shadows on the polished table, and my place settings were geometrically precise. Duncan took his seat at his father's right hand, the position of the heir apparent. I sat beside him, close enough that his hand could rest possessively on my knee, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like ownership. The conversation flowed as predictably as wine. Business successes, political opinions, family gossip, all delivered with the confident authority of people who'd never questioned their right to judge everyone else. I played my role perfectly, laughing at the right moments, asking admiring questions about Duncan's work, graciously accepting compliments on the table presentation. "Sienna's really found her groove this year," Laurel observed, raising her glass in my direction. "It's wonderful to see her embracing her role in the family." "She's learned a lot," Duncan agreed, his hand tightening slightly on my knee, "about what really matters in a marriage." I activated the recording app with what looked like a casual check of my phone notifications. "Duncan's been so patient with me," I said, smiling adoringly at my husband. "I used to think I knew what I wanted, but he's helped me understand how selfish that was." "Women today have so many confusing messages about independence," Uncle Armand added, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision. "It's refreshing to see one who understands that supporting her husband is the highest calling." "Exactly," Duncan said, warming to his favorite topic. "Sienna used to waste so much energy on things that didn't matter. Her little teaching job, her opinions about everything. I had to help her see that real fulfillment comes from being part of something bigger than herself." Jenna shifted uncomfortably beside Ryan, but she said nothing. She was watching Duncan now with undisguised fascination, like she was seeing something she'd never noticed before. "Tell them about the therapy," Duncan continued, his voice taking on the proud tone he used when discussing his professional victories. How Dr. Elliot helped you understand your problems. This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for months. I took a careful sip of wine, activated the recording with another casual phone gesture, and smiled with perfect, practiced gratitude. Dr. Elliot was wonderful, I began, my voice soft and humble. He helped me see how my need to have opinions about things was really just a way of trying to compete with Duncan instead of supporting him. The table murmured approval. Duncan's chest swelled with satisfaction. And I continued speaking, knowing that every word was being recorded, knowing that his family was hanging on every syllable of what they thought was my confession but was actually my testimony. He taught me that questioning Duncan's decisions wasn't love. It was selfishness disguised as caring. Real love meant trusting that my husband always knew what was best for both of us. Duncan nodded approvingly, completely unaware that I was about to detonate the perfect Christmas dinner he'd orchestrated. Because the confession wasn't over. It was just beginning. The approval around the table was palpable. Laurel beamed like a proud teacher whose difficult student had finally learned the lesson. Uncle Armand nodded sagely over his wine glass. Even Duncan's father, usually reserved in his praise, looked pleased with what he was hearing. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. The hardest part, I continued, my voice growing stronger, was learning to accept that my feelings were usually wrong. Dr. Elliot helped me understand that when Duncan criticized my cooking, my clothes, my work, my family, he wasn't being mean. He was trying to help me grow. Jenna's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Something in my tone had shifted, though the words themselves still sounded appropriately grateful. For instance, I said, settling back in my chair with the demeanor of someone sharing a heartwarming story, when Duncan told me last week that my job was glorified babysitting for people who couldn't handle real careers. I used to think that was cruel. But Dr. Elliot taught me to hear the love underneath. Duncan was protecting me from having unrealistic expectations about my own capabilities. The smile on Laurel's face flickered slightly. That didn't sound quite as heartwarming as she'd expected. Or when he explained to your dinner guests last month that I spent 3 hours getting ready because you know how women are about these things. He wasn't mocking me, he was helping them understand that my need for validation through appearance was a character flaw he was patiently managing. Ryan's girlfriend Jenna had stopped eating entirely now. Her eyes were fixed on my face with growing alarm. Duncan, meanwhile, was beginning to sense that something was wrong, though he couldn't quite identify what. The words I was saying were technically complimentary, but the tone was shifting into something he didn't recognize. And the financial education has been so valuable, I continued, my voice brightening as if I was sharing delightful news. Learning that we were too poor for me to spend money on coffee or new clothes while Duncan bought $300 bottles of wine taught me important lessons about priorities. Sienna, Duncan started, his voice carrying a warning. Oh, but the best lesson was about my family, I said, talking over him with the enthusiastic tone of someone sharing a wonderful revelation. When Duncan explained that my sister was always trying to stir up drama, and my parents were demanding for wanting us to visit, I finally understood. My love for my family was actually disloyalty to my husband. Choosing them over his preferences was selfish. The dining room had gone completely quiet except for the sound of my voice, and the gentle clink of crystal as Laurel's trembling hand set down her wine glass. Dr. Elliot called it proper submission, but I think of it as love. True love means accepting that your partner's comfort matters more than your own dignity, that their reputation is more important than your feelings, that their version of reality is more valid than your lived experience. Sienna, stop. Duncan's voice was sharp now, cutting through the room like a blade. You're being dramatic again. Am I? I asked, tilting my head with innocent curiosity. But I'm just sharing what I learned in therapy, about how my need to have opinions was really a form of disrespect. How my emotions were inconvenient obstacles to Duncan's happiness. How my desire for basic kindness was actually selfishness in disguise. Uncle Armand was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing horror. This wasn't the grateful testimonial he'd expected to hear. For example, I continued, my voice gaining momentum, when Duncan told his law school friend Armand that marriage is the ultimate long con, and that he'd found someone grateful enough to think they're lucky. That's enough. Duncan's hand slammed down on the table, making the china jump. Wine sloshed from overturned glasses, staining the perfect white tablecloth like blood. But I wasn't stopping. Not now. He was sharing wisdom about how to find a wife who would function as an unpaid maid, chef, and cheerleader while contributing half the household income. It's really quite brilliant when you think about it. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension to absolute horror. How did you? Duncan started, then stopped, realizing that finishing the question would be an admission. How did I know about your conversations with Armand Stanton? I asked pleasantly. The same way I know about the tripled life insurance policy you took out on me. The same way I know about your internet searches for undetectable poisons and making suicide look convincing. Gemma gasped audibly. Laurel's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. Duncan's face had gone white, then red, then a mottled combination that suggested his blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. You went through my private emails, he said, his voice deadly quiet. You violated my privacy. Privacy, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling it when a husband researches ways to kill his wife? I never, Duncan began, but I was already reaching into my purse. Actually, I said, pulling out a manila envelope, I have copies of everything. The emails, the insurance documents, the browser history. It's all quite fascinating reading. I placed the envelope on the table between the holiday's centerpiece and Duncan's untouched plate, where everyone could see it but no one dared to touch it. Should we read some highlights aloud? I asked. For the family? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. The envelope sat on the pristine white tablecloth like evidence at a crime scene, which, I was beginning to realize, it essentially was. Duncan stared at it with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. You're having some kind of breakdown, he said finally, his voice struggling for the controlled tone he'd perfected over the years. This is exactly the kind of dramatic behavior Dr. Elliot warned us about. Dramatic, I repeated, savoring the word. Yes, I suppose discovering your husband's murder fantasies could be considered dramatic. I turned to address the table directly. Should I read the email where Duncan asked Armand for advice on handling the Sienna problem permanently? Laurel made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Duncan, what is she talking about? She's having a mental health crisis, Duncan said, standing so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. She's been acting increasingly unstable for months. This is clearly some kind of psychotic episode. Sit down, I said quietly. Something in my tone made him freeze. For the first time in our entire marriage, Duncan Spencer was afraid of me. Sit down, I repeated, and let me show your family who you really are. I opened the envelope and removed the first document, a printed email thread. This is from March 15th. Duncan writing to Armand Stanton. The teacher thing is getting old. She acts like finger painting is actual work. Might be time to remind her how replaceable she is. I looked up at the faces around the table. Ryan had gone pale. Jenna was staring at Duncan like she'd never seen him before. Uncle Armand, the family patriarch who'd always spoken so fondly of strong marriages, looked like he might be sick. Here's a good one from April, I continued, selecting another page. Duncan again, tripled her life insurance today. Agent didn't even question it. Amazing how much people trust a successful lawyer. Stop it, Duncan hissed, but his authority had evaporated. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own words being read aloud. But wait, it gets better. I found the email that had haunted my nightmares for months. May 3rd. Research is fascinating. Apparently domestic accidents are statistically most common in kitchens and bathrooms. Slippery surfaces, hard edges, very believable. Laurel pushed her chair back from the table so violently it scraped against the hardwood floor. That's not Duncan wouldn't what, mother? I asked gently. Wouldn't systematically abuse his wife for years, wouldn't isolate her from every person who cared about her. Wouldn't research methods of killing her for insurance money. I pulled out another document. Here's the browser history from his laptop. Untraceable poisons. Signs of natural death versus suicide. How long before missing persons investigations begin? The silence was broken only by the sound of Jenna's quiet crying. Ryan had put his arm around her, but his eyes never left his brother's face. This is insane, Duncan said, but his voice cracked on the words. She's making this up, doctoring documents. She's been acting increasingly paranoid, and I'm making up the recordings too. I asked, pulling out my phone. Duncan's face went gray. What recordings? Oh, just conversations we've had, like the one from last Tuesday when you told me I was too stupid to survive without you. Or Friday's discussion where you explained that my teaching job was a hobby for women who couldn't handle real responsibility. I scrolled through the audio files on my phone, each one labeled with a date and brief description. Months of evidence, carefully collected and stored. Would you like to hear your voice explaining to Dr. Elliot how women need firm guidance or they become unmanageable? Or perhaps the conversation with your colleague Leon where you called me your training project? Duncan lunged for my phone, but I was ready for him. I stepped back smoothly, the device safely out of his reach. Violence, Duncan. In front of your family, how unlike you to lose control. Uncle Armand found his voice first. Duncan, is any of this true? Duncan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked around the table at his family, his parents, his brother, his girlfriend, his uncle, all staring at him with expressions of horror and dawning understanding. She's lying, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him. She's been unstable for months. This is all fabricated. Then explain the life insurance policy, Ryan said quietly. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Explain the emails. Explain why you've been researching ways to kill your wife. I haven't. I wasn't. Duncan's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand. She's not who you think she is. She's manipulative. She's controlling.
She's sitting right here,
I said calmly, listening to you describe the very behavior you've been exhibiting for years. I turned to face Laurel, who was sitting frozen in her chair like a statue of maternal horror. Your son has spent our entire marriage systematically destroying my self-worth, isolating me from my support system, and convincing me that I was lucky to be abused. When that stopped working, he started planning my death. No, Laurel whispered. No, Duncan is a good man. He's successful. He's respected. He's a predator, I said simply. A very intelligent, very charming predator, who chose a victim he thought would never fight back. I gathered the documents and placed them back in the envelope. The police already have copies of everything, so does my attorney, so does my sister, who knows exactly where I am and what I'm doing right now. Duncan had slumped back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate.
Sienna, please. We can work this out. The therapy is helping.
Dr. Elliot said.
Dr. Elliot, I interrupted, specializes in teaching abusive men how to gaslight their victims more effectively.
Did you really think I didn't research him? I stood up from the table, my legs steadier than they'd been in months. I'll be staying somewhere safe tonight. Divorce papers will be served tomorrow. If you attempt to contact me, follow me, or interfere with my life in any way, these recordings and documents will be sent to your law firm, your clients, and every legal publication in the state. I looked around the table one final time, taking in the wreckage of what had been 30 minutes ago, a perfect family Christmas dinner. Thank you for a lovely meal, I said politely, and Merry Christmas. I walked out of that dining room, out of that house, and out of Duncan Spencer's life forever. Behind me, I could hear the sound of his perfect world finally, completely, falling apart. I sat in my car outside the Spencer estate, hands gripping the steering wheel, waiting for my heart to stop hammering against my ribs. Through the tall windows I could see shadows moving in the dining room, gestures that looked like arguing, someone standing and pacing, the blur of what might have been Laurel covering her face with her hands. My phone buzzed. Duncan's number flashed on the screen. Then again, and again. I turned the phone off and drove to the safe house Sarah had arranged, a small apartment above her law office that she kept for clients in situations exactly like mine. The key was where she'd said it would be, hidden behind a loose brick near the service entrance. The apartment was sparse but clean, a bed, a table, basic kitchen supplies, and most importantly, a landline telephone that couldn't be traced to my personal accounts. I called Jenna first. Sienna? Thank God. Are you safe? I'm safe. It's done. All of it? All of it. The recording, the documents, everything. I sank into the single chair by the window. Jenna, you should have seen their faces. His mother looked like someone had slapped her. His brother couldn't even look at him. Good, she said fiercely. Good. How are you feeling? I considered the question seriously. Terrified, relieved, like I just jumped off a cliff and I'm not sure if I'm flying or falling. You're flying, Jenna said, without hesitation. You've been planning this for months. You're the strongest person I know. After we hung up, I called Sarah's emergency line. How did it go? She asked immediately. Better than expected. I got everything on recording. His family heard all of it. The emails, the life insurance, the research about killing me. There's no way he can convince them this was some kind of misunderstanding. Any threats? Did he try to follow you? No, but he's been calling my phone. I turned it off. Good, keep it off tonight. Tomorrow we file the restraining order and serve the divorce papers. Are you ready for the fallout? I thought about Duncan's face when I'd read his emails aloud, the way his confident mask had cracked and shattered, revealing the small, desperate man underneath. I'm ready. But even as I said it, I knew the real challenge was just beginning. Duncan wouldn't accept this quietly. Men like him never did. He'd try to control the narrative, paint me as unstable, use his professional connections to discredit my evidence. The difference was, I was ready for that fight now. I had documentation, witnesses, legal representation, and most importantly, I had remembered who I was underneath all his careful conditioning. My phone, still turned off, sat silent on the table, but I could imagine the messages accumulating. Duncan's attempts to explain, to manipulate, to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond his reach. Let him try. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of his anger. I was afraid of what I might do with my freedom. The woman who had walked into that Christmas dinner was Duncan Spencer's wife, playing a role she'd perfected through months of careful planning. The woman who had walked out was simply Sienna, and Sienna had plans of her own. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of my new apartment, a sunny 2-bedroom place, near the elementary school where I taught. Sunlight streamed through windows I could open whenever I wanted, highlighting walls painted in colors I had chosen myself. Pale yellow in the living room, soft green in what would become my office, and in the bedroom, lavender, the color Duncan had once called childish. The divorce had moved faster than Sarah had predicted. Duncan's family, horrified by what they'd witnessed at Christmas dinner, had refused to support him financially or emotionally. His law firm, concerned about the potential scandal if my recordings became public, had quietly encouraged him to accept the settlement terms without contest. He'd kept the house, but lost half of everything else. More importantly, he'd lost his reputation. Word had spread through the legal community, not from me, but from his own colleagues who'd heard whispers about the Christmas dinner incident. Clients began requesting different attorneys. Invitations to professional events dried up. The golden boy of Spencer and Associates found himself increasingly isolated. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Revenge, it turned out, was far less sweet than freedom. My phone rang as I arranged books on my new shelves. Books about poetry and psychology, teaching methodology and women's history. All the subjects Duncan had dismissed as worthless. "How's the new place?" Jenna's voice was warm with genuine happiness. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. "Come see it this weekend. I'm cooking dinner for everyone." Everyone. The word would have terrified me a year ago. Duncan had trained me to believe that entertaining was stressful, that I wasn't good enough at it, that people only tolerated my efforts out of politeness. Now I was looking forward to filling my space with laughter and conversation. Laurel Stanton, my friend from college, not Duncan's mother, was driving up from the city. Sarah was bringing her partner, and their twin daughters, my sister, my parents, my teaching colleagues who'd become real friends again, once I'd stopped declining every invitation. "What can I bring?" Jenna asked. "Just yourself. I want to cook for people who actually want to be here." After we hung up, I continued unpacking. In a box marked personal items, I found the notebook I'd kept hidden for months, the one where I'd documented Duncan's abuse and tracked my own awakening. I flipped through pages of my handwriting, reading entries that felt like letters from another lifetime. Day 1, read the first entry. Below it, in different ink from a different day. Day 2, remembered that I used to be interesting. I carried the notebook to my new office and placed it in the desk drawer. Not hidden this time, just stored safely with other important documents. Evidence of where I'd been, but not a map of where I was going. The woman who'd written those desperate secret entries was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know, someone who made decisions without asking permission, who painted walls in colors that made her happy, who bought coffee without justifying the expense to anyone. Someone who was learning, slowly and carefully, how to trust her own voice again. The evening sun slanted through my lavender bedroom, painting everything soft and golden. Tomorrow I would teach children about courage and kindness. This weekend I would cook for friends who valued my thoughts and stories, and Duncan Spencer, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, could no longer touch any of it. I was free. 1 year later, Christmas Eve found me in my own kitchen, preparing dinner for the family I'd chosen, rather than the one I'd escaped. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air, as I basted the roast, humming along to jazz music that Duncan would have called depressing. Jenna arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen in years. "You look happy," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like winter air, and her favorite perfume. "I am happy," I realized, saying the words aloud for perhaps the first time in my adult life. The evening unfolded in waves of warmth and laughter. Laurel told stories about her veterinary practice that had everyone crying with laughter. Sarah's daughters, now 7, performed an elaborate puppet show they'd written about brave princesses who saved themselves. My parents, finally relaxed after months of worrying about me, shared embarrassing childhood stories that would have mortified me once upon a time. No one walked on eggshells. No one monitored their tone or checked my face for signs of disapproval. When I burned the dinner rolls, we laughed about it and ate them anyway. When Jenna spilled wine on my couch, we cleaned it up together without drama or accusation. This was what love looked like: messy, imperfect, unconditional. Later, after everyone had gone home, I sat by my Christmas tree with a cup of tea and called the domestic violence hotline where I'd started volunteering. Tonight I was covering the holiday shift, ready to answer calls from women who might be spending Christmas walking on eggshells or worse. Crisis line, "This is Sienna." The voice on the other end was young, scared, familiar in all the ways that mattered. "I think I need help," she whispered. "But I'm not sure if what's happening to me counts as abuse." I settled back in my chair, cradling the phone like the lifeline it had become, not just for the callers, but for me. "Tell me what's happening," I said gently. "And let me help you figure it out." Outside, snow began to fall on a Christmas Eve that belonged entirely to me.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.